Hi guys, I'm Chloe and I'm from Eng Lang Pro. And today I'm going to be running through Unit 4, all about identity. So going through all the different factors that influence our identity so that you can use this to boost your essays and even your ACs and short answer questions as well for Unit 3 for English Language for VCE. Eng Lang Pro has a bunch of YouTube videos about all different topics related to 3-4 English language. So feel free to check them out. I scored overall 50 in 2023 and all the creators did similarly. So we're really here to help you understand and achieve your goals in English language. So jumping straight into it, Unit 4 usually takes place during semester 2. So it's okay if you haven't touched on it yet if it's earlier in the year for you. But it is really helpful once you do learn it, putting it back into Unit 3 and figuring out sort of how you can apply that knowledge, I suppose, throughout your ACs and short answer questions as well. Unit 4 is mostly about identity. So when you think of identity, I want you to think about all the things that make up who you are. So there's a lot of different aspects that make up your identity. Immediately, you might think about, like my name and my family and things like that. But we want to categorize them down into specific sort of categories that are easier to talk about. So today we're going to be talking about age, so how old you are, your occupation, so your job, your gender, and if through gender we're thinking about gender identity, so whether you sort of identify as like a woman or girl, boy or man, or non-binary or something else. Your education status, so how educated you are, whether you've completed high school, which obviously you haven't completed high school, completed uni, only completed primary school, something like that. Your interests, so what hobbies you like to do, what groups you're a part of, maybe like sports teams you go for or something like that, and values, so things that essentially that you value, that you appreciate, or beliefs and ideals that you have. And what we want to be thinking about is in any given person, especially in like modern media, how do their all of those factors, how are they displayed through the way in which they speak? So let me give an example, right? If I chose someone really well known, I really hope you guys know what I'm talking about. But let's say I chose Jojo Siwa, right? Okay. If you don't know who Jojo Siwa is, go Google her. If I talked about the way in which she speaks is sort of iconic, right? So her young age comes through in the way she uses slang, and she uses all this like, I suppose these neologisms that are like very new or made up. Occupation as like a dancer or a singer might mean she might use specific jargon that only dancers and singers understand, or even as a content creator, things like specific digital jargon related to like TikTok and things like that only people in that field will understand. So her gender identity, which is sort of potentially like mainly like girl, woman, I think, and like potentially non-binary, has that come through in the way that maybe she's more progressive or non-discriminatory when referring to different genders, and potentially is she more polite or less sort of like assertive because of her gender. Education, so I think she finished high school, so how does that come through in the way in which she speaks? Does she use super complex lexemes or something like that? And then interests, so let's say she's interested in dance or something like that. How does that come through in the way in which you use a specific slang, sort of similar to occupation there? But you can also do interests as in like you might have an occupation of being like a doctor, let's say, and your interest might be gardening, you know what I mean? So they can be very different sort of their things. And then values might be, I really value progressive societies. I really value, the need for everyone to like have freedom or something like that. So they can be really broad down to really specific. For example, I value having Netflix on my TV. Like it can really depend on the context. So what we're going to have to do is try and identify different aspects that make up people. So when you're getting your examples for your essays specifically, if it's an identity-based essay, you might have different paragraphs based on different aspects of identity. And throughout each example, you're going to be like discussing a certain person, probably, whether that's like the Prime Minister. Obviously, Jojo Siwa you're not going to do because she's not Australian. You're going to do someone Australian. Whether that's the Prime Minister, whether that's like an actor, whether that's your grandma, you're going to have these like characters almost throughout the examples that you've picked from modern, like contemporary Australian media. For those people, you're going to have to identify certain aspects of their identity and how those aspects come through in the way that they speak. So let's go through each sort of one, and I'll kind of each sort of aspect of identity that I've got here. There is other ones. This is not an exhaustive list. You could do sexuality, you could do aspirations. There's other things you could do as well, but these are some of the core ones, I'd say. And if you just do these ones, you'd be fine too. I'm going to go through different variations of each of the different identity aspects and how they could influence your language, specifically with like some meta language of what you could be sort of looking for. So starting with age, right? So you're either going to be looking at people, like chances are you'll look at people, I think a good way to go is like teenagers. So look at people in your own sort of demographic, right? So how do young people speak? How do we speak? Think about, because I'm also a young person, think about things like the slang that we use, right? We say slay, we say riz, all of those sort of things. You can put those into your essays, use those as examples. I suggest you could use anecdotes of your friends saying them, or you could use, TikTok comments of someone saying them, just as long as you're sure as a teenager. But yeah, so you'll look for slang, you'll look for like neologisms, it'll be anything that's like shortenings, it could be informal initialisms, informal acronyms, anything that's sort of non-standard. Younger ages tend to use informal language. There's no point sort of picking out a young person that's using really formal language unless that's really indicative of a different part of their identity. So for young people, we want to be talking about their sort of informal and creative language. What does that say about them? It says that they're rebellious, often using these really sort of, I suppose, non-standard lexemes and things like that. It's really rebellious because it's against the traditional norm, I suppose. It's creative as well, so you can definitely talk about the creativity and sort of innovation of young people. And then as well, how it tries to create an in-group membership. So because, like, let's say that I say slay, and we're all saying slay, all the people in our generation, right? We're all saying slay. It sort of creates this, like, in-group, right? Because we all know what slay means, but our parents don't know what it means. So that's sort of like, I suppose, creates like an exclusive sort of feeling, I suppose. So being able to sort of separate yourselves from older generations, or even like particular younger, even like alpha generations, it sort of gives that in-group membership and makes you feel like a part of something, included, all of that sort of stuff. So you can sort of talk about how younger age groups do that as well. In a similar way, older age groups, they can also use specific language that links to in-group membership. So when older age groups they do have their own slang. I can't think of any off the top of my head because I am not old, but older age groups have their own slang as well, which they use to connect to each other and exclude younger generations as well. But often you'll find more likely that they might be using really standard, really proper language, potentially discriminatory language, so refusing to say they, them, or refusing to, it might even be like refusing to do an acknowledgement of country, something like that, because that's particularly relevant this year in the study design for 2025. But yeah, so potentially looking for those things, even just ideals. So just ideal things like, believing that there is a one singular set standard sort of way to speak English, and that there's like any deviation that is not on. So we're looking at like a lot of like grandparents or elderly people sort of believe that, like, maybe English language is getting ruined by all of this slang and stuff like that. So looking for those would be an indicative, like would indicate an older generation or an older age group. Also, just keep in mind, a really good point to make is when you're talking about how people try and use each other's slang. So if an older person tries to use a younger person's sort of speech or a young person's slang, how that sort of makes them appear. So younger people might be like, whoa, that was weird. Don't be saying slay. You're 60, it's strange. So how does that make them appear? And what does it say about them if they are trying to use young person slang? Does it say they're trying to be more youthful, trying to be more rebellious or creative, or they're trying to fit in that in-group? And is it working for them? So think about all those different things. Okay, moving on. So occupation. So thinking about your career and your job. So this is generally applicable to like adults, even like adults that are a little bit older as well, that have established careers. So how might their occupation come through in their language? It'll mainly be through jargon, especially if it's like a professional field. So lawyers, doctors, politicians, anything like that, they'll all use jargon, which is indicative of their occupation, right? They know those words and they know what to say because of their expertise in that field. So you really want to talk about expertise there. It certainly shows their level of knowledge, I suppose, and their professionalism as well. Another thing in occupations that generally in those sort of higher up occupations, so lawyers, doctors, things that you would consider to earn a lot of money probably, they're likely to use more standard, more formal language. So take note of those formal language features, and sort of address those as indicating those occupations. However, for other occupations, for example, a tradie, right? A tradie might stereotypically use more informal language. They might have their own jargon, certainly. I have no doubt there is tradie jargon for specific trade fields of things that you wouldn't know unless you were in that field. So that certainly is still applicable. Same with athletes. But they might have a little bit more of a laid back sort of informal use of language as well. So noting that, especially tradies in Australia, they're considered pretty laid back, pretty casual, pretty friendly. How might their language indicate that about them being a tradie, if that makes sense? So we want to think about their language and how does that show that they're a tradie? I hope that makes sense. You can definitely go through. I'm being pretty broad, but I know I'm giving you jargon, for lawyer and doctor and stuff, I'm saying formal language features. So I'm not going through all of the very specific features, but being able to, if you have a really good grasp of your informal and your formal features, there's nothing new here that you need to learn. But just being able to sort of apply those as you see fit. For example, a lawyer might use a lot of proper nouns and a tradie might use a lot of shortenings. So being able to sort of fit those formal, informal concepts within identity to show and talk about identity. Then for gender, so keeping our discussion really open, I think is really important that this isn't, everything we're talking about here is pretty stereotypical. So obviously there can be a lawyer that uses informal language, just like there can be, there's obviously women, men, non-binary people that use all sorts of language, and things you say don't necessarily show who you are in that sense. But we're talking about stereotypically, right? So stereotypically, women and girls, and I'd say non-binary people and people of other genders as well, are stereotypically more polite, or really adhere to politeness strategies. Not more polite, just really adhere to those politeness strategies. So really attending to other people's positive and negative face. They can be particularly timid, potentially. They might use a quieter volume. Girls and women also tend to go up at the end of a rising intonation at the end of their sentences, especially teenage girls. So you can sort of link that to gender and age as well. But yeah, so talking about how, okay, if women and girls are using all these politeness strategies, what does that show about them? Maybe they're potentially more oppressed, and same with non-binary and other gendered people, absolutely more oppressed. They might, you could potentially link that to the opportunities in jobs and the wage gap, things like that. And essentially how potentially the patriarchy sort of influences the way that women and girls speak or feel like they can speak in society, especially if it's a social sort of setting or a professional setting. I'd say would be the most applicable there, professional setting. So if there's a woman being particularly polite in a professional setting, is she doing that in order to be liked? Is she doing that in order to get a job? Why is she doing that? For men and boys, obviously there's still plenty of politeness coming from men and boys, but it's a little bit less indicative. It's less salient, I suppose, to mention. For men and boys, it could be more indicative, I suppose, of their identity to mention their sort of mateship and kinship type informality. So calling each other mate or brother or things like that are especially sort of, I guess related to a brotherhood, things like that. And they'll tend to be more informal. So if you're talking about, let's say, Anthony Albanese, right, the way that he speaks isn't necessarily very indicative of him being a man. Obviously, he is a man. He identifies as a man, but that's not something that's really coming through his language a lot. Whereas if you had like a really blokey sort of tradey person in your like specific example, and they kept calling everyone like brother and mate or something, then that might be really indicative of their gender identity, if that makes sense. So you do need to be careful about which aspects of identity you choose to pull on in each circumstance. Don't go through all of them. They might not all be relevant to that specific person, but just think about what's really jumping out at you that they're really showing through their language. Okay, next we have education. I think this one is a big one, and it's like quite often present. So education, we're talking about literally how much education a person has had. So if you've had a lot of education, then that's, it's demonstrating you're probably like, we're thinking high level university, you've got like an honors or a master's or a PhD or even just a university degree, that's highly educated. Anything less than that, like if you've just completed year 12, not bad. If you haven't even gotten that far, then probably lowly educated, especially if you're, obviously if you're a child, you're not going to be that educated, but especially if you're like, a middle-aged adult and you only got to the end of year 12 and you didn't do any like further education, and that includes things like TAFE, then that's sort of like may come through in the way that you speak. So generally people that are highly educated, they'll use a lot of formal language. So we're looking for politicians, we're looking for just people in the social domain, even if they're just presenting podcasts, authors, anyone that's sort of professional, I suppose, they are going to be using formal language. Highly educated correlates pretty much to formal language because when you're highly educated, you know how to use that language and you know about that language. Generally, I'd say people with higher education have probably like a broader, more complex vocabulary than people that are lower educated. It also relates to their socioeconomic status. So if you are higher educated, it's more likely that you have a higher socioeconomic status. It's like, again, this is a stereotype, but if you have a higher socioeconomic status, like let's say you live in a really, really nice area with really like, fancy rich people, that might come through in the way that you speak. Maybe you'll have a more cultivated Australian accent, a more like posh British sort of way of speaking. Maybe you'll use a lot of proper nouns. Maybe you'll use a lot of normalizations. Think about all your formal language features. They'll come through in the way that you speak. Whereas if you have a lower socioeconomic status and you live in a different sort of area and you don't have a lot of education, maybe you use more shortenings. Maybe you use more of a broad accent. Let's think about even people that live rurally, potentially like they might speak in a certain way, and that's indicative potentially of their education or even their geographical location. So thinking about the way that you speak and how that reflects potentially how much education you've got, and your socioeconomic status. You don't have to get too caught up in like, I suppose, making it sound correct. It just needs to be like, even if it's a stereotype, that's okay. You can sort of make assumptions, I suppose, as long as they're like relatively politically correct assumptions. You don't want to be asserting your opinion into these. Okay, continuing on. So we have interests. So things that you're interested in will come through in the way you speak. I'll give you some examples. So hobbies, let's say you play footy and that's your hobby. You might mention some footy players by nicknames. So that might be shortenings, maybe diminutive endings. Maybe you'll, what else might you do? Let's say, for example, I really like Harry Styles or like Taylor Swift. So I might use, again, diminutive endings and make the word like Swifties. You know what I mean? So the way that the things that you like and the way that you speak are like, I suppose, intrinsically interlinked. So being able to understand that the slang that you use that's specific to one sort of interest that you have, that is, I suppose, indicative of your identity. As well as that, we've got like social groups. So think about what, like the person you're using in your example again, what social groups they're part of, what extracurriculars do they do, what hobbies do they do, and how can we tell they do those hobbies by the way that they speak. Now, if you're just saying, I play soccer, that's not indicative of the way you speak. But if you keep mentioning it, maybe repetition could be something you could use. Otherwise, it's generally going to be like slang and jargon related to that specific field. And thinking about as well, maybe if I said Swifties, how could I relate that obviously to my interests, but how could I also relate that to maybe my gender, maybe my age? So all of those things are sort of linked under my identity. And just finishing off for values, right? Think about anything that that person values. It could be anything that, like, if you're talking about yourself, think about anything that you value. Whether that's like, we're not talking about, oh, you know, I value my phone. Try and make it a little bit more complex than that. Oh, I value the digital age. I value digital technology or something. I value, you know, innovation or opportunities for women in sport, things like that. So is what you value traditional, or is it conservative, or is it, you know, progressive? Is it modern? Think about all the different things and ways you could label what someone values. And then how are you going to link those to their language choices? So let's talk about it. So if I value women in sport, I might use more pronouns. I might use inclusive language, non-derogatory, non-discriminatory language. But also I might have like some specific women in sport jargon or slang, I suppose. Whereas, for example, if I value traditionalism, I'm going to use very descriptivist, very standard, very proper language. And that shows the things that I value. Not only does it show potentially my age, my gender, or my occupation, it also shows the things that I value. So, for example, let's say you have like a 50-year-old lawyer, and they're, you know, presenting on a podcast or something. They might use really proper language, showing potentially their age as being really, I suppose, descriptivist, as like an older person. It might show their value for traditionalism, their value for like the English language being the same or something. And as well as that, it's going to show potentially their profession and like jargon and things like that. And those things are kind of linked because let's say you really value, you know, the law is very written, it's very rigid, and that sort of links into your value of traditionalism. So think about this sort of like map, I suppose, this sort of spider web of all these different concepts and how you can link them together. Your paragraphs generally will just be like one, let's say you might do a paragraph on like education and then talk about, oh, you know, this person's showing their education through saying that, and this person's showing their education through saying that. It can even be that a lot of the time people alter their identity. So alter maybe how educated they like appear. They might change. Like I was talking about when older people try and use younger people's language. So when educated people try and use non-educated language. So think about the example of like, if Anthony Albanese said like Delulu with no Salulu or something, or Peter does, someone like that. Someone really educated said something that's like, you know, typically said by, you know, teenagers or uneducated people. What does that show about them? Why are they trying to do that? Are they trying to seem less educated to appeal to a certain audience? So think about the intention behind them trying to display those aspects of their identity as well. I know I've just infodumped a lot of information. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to slow it down and go through again. And I know this hasn't come with specific examples, but there's other videos we have that sort of feature those specific examples based on those identity paragraphs. So feel free to check out those as well. Good luck. Thank you.